Hello and welcome to World Talks on TVP World with me, Ashim Kumar. Today we're joined by Nino Kallandadze, founder and executive director of the Chavchavadze Center, and a former Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs of Georgia. We'll be discussing whether Georgia can escape Russian influence amid ongoing protests and controversial government decisions, such as the recently announced successor parties law. With democracy under threat and the geopolitical stakes high, what's next for Georgia and its future in Europe? Welcome to TVP World, and thank you very much for taking the time.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Thanks for having me.
Good afternoon. A pleasure. Okay, so let's start with the successor parties law. Talk us through its implications, please.
Well, thanks again. As you mentioned, Georgia is indeed facing severe crisis. In fact, 34 years after gaining independence, and today we're celebrating a historic date that marks the 34th anniversary of Georgia's referendum, in which 99% of the population voted for the independence. The country risks ceasing to exist as a sovereign nation, losing its independence and falling completely back under Russian control. The Russian-backed regime that has seized power through massively falsified elections and brutally suppressed peaceful demonstrators is consolidating its power towards a full-fledged autocracy. However, while this regime has not yet managed to secure international legitimacy, it continues to target political and civil society opponents as well as independent media. Just hours ago, Georgian Dream Parliamentary Economic Committee has approved a draft law that would ban broadcasters from receiving foreign funds, operating under the assumption that eventually Western actors will be forced to negotiate with them, with a particular emphasis on President Trump, hoping that DC's somewhat lenient approach toward Putin would ultimately benefit our domestic oligarch as well. Now, the challenge is thereby that internal balance of power is overwhelmingly disproportionate. On the one hand, you have the entire state apparatus with parliament, law enforcement agencies, backed by vast financial and administrative resources, which is strongly believed that is directly supported from Russian intelligence services, providing logistical, financial, and propaganda aid. On the other side, there are unarmed citizens fighting with their bare hands with no institutional protection whatsoever. Now, because this is not a democratic regime and therefore not subject to conventional pressure, despite ongoing protests, the regime has continued to follow the Russian playbook, passing laws that restrict civil society, independent media, and all pro-Western political forces. Meanwhile, a parliamentary investigative commission, the so-called investigative commission, mirroring classic Kremlin Soviet-era tactics, that is working to rewrite history. Its sole purpose is to brand pro-Western political forces as criminals and ultimately outlaw them constitutionally. More importantly, it aims to discredit Georgia's most successful years in recent history and punish in an exemplary manner the political force, the country and its society for daring to turn west, demonstrating that Georgia could exist and develop without Russian dominance. 2 days ago, they went further, and the Commission already indicated the plan to make former President Saakashvili and therefore the state responsible for the 2008 war, an absurdly false allegation repeatedly disproven by international courts, but constantly and vehemently promoted by Moscow. Obviously, in light of Russia's 2014 invasion of Ukraine and the full-scale war launched 3 years ago, there is no doubt internationally about who the aggressor was in 2008. The narrative must be dictated directly by Moscow, serving as an attempt to rewrite history and set a precedent for punishing pro-Western leaderships in the region, discouraging others from ever turning their backs on Russia, and most dangerously, and this is what many fear here, preparing the grounds for recognizing Georgia's historic territories currently under Russian occupation as independent states, which will have disastrous results in the long run if passed.
Understood. Thank you very much. A lot to go through there. But before we continue, let's have a quick look at a short video, and then I'll ask for your opinion on it.
Because if the Russian hybrid strategy, to a degree, succeeds in Georgia, it will be tested elsewhere. We are the main testing ground. We have been, in 2008, the main testing ground for Russian military aggression. And some 15 years later, we are now the testing ground for hybrid strategy. And that should be a concern for all our European partners, because it might be something that we've seen Russia testing it in Romania, in Moldova. That's not the end of it if we do not stop it there, and it has to be stopped in Georgia.
Right, so that was former President Zurabishvili. Now, talk us through the big picture geopolitically. What is in it for Russia? Can you lay that out for us?
Well, again, there is obviously a huge pro-democracy movement as we speak, but whether Georgia can win this battle depends on broader geopolitical developments, and particularly Trump's proposed peace mediation in Ukraine, how successful will be the outcome of the war in Ukraine, because it's ultimately the same battle. It depends on Europe's ability to consolidate its position, both internally and in the region, the extent to which both Europe and Washington can remain committed to Georgia's democratic future, because, again, ultimately it's a battle over what kind of governance will prevail in Georgia. Given Georgia's strategic geopolitical significance due to the growing importance of the Trans-Caspian international transit route and the Middle Corridor, authoritarian regimes like China and particularly Russia want Georgia to be authoritarian, free from regulatory constraints and transparency that democracy imposes. Europe, on the other hand, and hopefully the US too, need Georgia to be a democracy where economic development follows international norms and is safeguarded by the rule-based global order.
Well,
now,
that might be excuse me, but that might be something that Europe and the United States want. But I mean, what can they do? I mean, this is an independent country, after all. What can they do?
Well, what they have been doing so far is supporting Georgia's democratic development, because obviously they also have vested interests in the region. And in the region, I emphasize the region because what happens in Georgia will not stay in Georgia. It will have wider implications, particularly when it comes to the Caucasus region. Now the talks have started with Armenia to become closer to EU. Now all these attempts may fail if Russia maintains its control over Tbilisi, which is at this point an ultimate goal of Putin and Moscow. Now, simultaneously, what is going on in Ukraine, it's the same war. It's basically the same war that started in 2008 in Georgia, then continued in 2014 in Ukraine, and now was followed by the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. And I fully share the risks and the understanding that it's not only and not directly about Georgia and Ukraine. It's about a bigger picture, and the threat goes beyond. It's about safeguarding the region. It's about safeguarding the region for Russia's strategic interests. And it's key for them to keep the West out of Georgia, to keep the Western interest and Western presence out of Georgia. That is why at the initial stage, the Foreign Agents Law was introduced, targeting all the civil society and media organizations that were Western funded, obviously.
Right. Well, certainly Foreign Agents Law, the successor parties law, all seem targeted at moving Georgia towards a single-party state. In addition, of course, we have a frozen conflict on the land, on the territory of Georgia, as we do in Ukraine now, and in Moldova, in Transnistria region. So all standard Russian playbook. How much influence? I mean, you know, there have been demonstrations going on in Georgia ever since talks with the EU were called off at the end of last year. And they seem to well, not the seem, but they've certainly taken on additional energy since this latest pronouncement. How much can they change the people that are on the streets right now?
The pro-democracy movement was key when it comes to pushing the international community into recognizing or acknowledging that the elections were falsified, that the results may not be recognized, and that this is an illegitimate government now in place, negotiating with which it should not be an option. But it's a power struggle. It's it's a battle for Georgia's future that hangs on whether this democratic movement can sustain its resilience. At the same time, Ivanishvili will try to buy time, weaken the movement, and strengthen his bargaining positions in international negotiations. This is a power struggle, and victory will depend on how quickly the West consolidates its commitment to the region, deciding that engaging with an illegitimate regime is not an option, keeping it isolated, increasing pressure to push for new elections, also using further sanctions that are available. However, this must happen quickly before the people's ability to resist is exhausted, which becomes increasingly challenging given the immense pressure and power imbalance that I mentioned.
What about, very, very quickly now, if you would, please, what about the Constitutional Court in Georgia? Is there something they can do to slow down the passing of this law?
Completely under regime's control, 100%.
Understood.
There are no independent institutions. The state capture is on a full scale since probably 2016.
Understood. Well,
the takeover of the major broadcasting major TV broadcasting channels, and then the courts, and then the Central Election Commission, etc. So the state capture is on a full scale, and the Constitutional Court will do whatever it is instructed to do.
Understood. Well, we will of course be keeping a very close eye on what goes on. Nino Kalańdadze. Nino, thank you very much for coming along on TVP World and explaining all of this to our audience. Come and see us again soon. Thank you.
Thanks for your time.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
And that's all from us here on TVP World. Goodbye.